I'm our humanitarian representative based in Ottawa. So I act as our focal point for the Canadian government on any issue of humanitarian diplomacy or advocacy that we might do. So that includes a fairly large portfolio of work on access to medicines issues, which includes everything from intellectual property rights through to the research and development system that in theory delivers the technologies that we need. So MSF is Doctors Without Borders, or Médecins Sans Frontières. We go by MSF, our French acronym, but we're an international medical humanitarian organization, provides impartial medical assistance to people in more than 70 different countries. So we're a very large organization. We have typically between sort of 50 to 70,000 staff at any given moment. As I say, we're in 70 different countries and roughly 460 to 470 different projects, ranging from basic community level public health interventions through to complex tertiary care hospitals. We focus on the delivery of essential health services in some of the world's most complex environments. So this is providing care to people who are affected by armed conflict, disease epidemics, natural disasters, and other kinds of emergencies. So the COVID-19 pandemic, in a sense, is familiar territory for us in that we respond to disease epidemics nearly every day. Typically that takes the form of measles, cholera, yellow fever, today Ebola in DRC. But really we're facing an unprecedented crisis from the COVID-19 pandemic that's been created both directly in terms of the needing to respond to COVID-19 and ensure that there are appropriate models of care to provide treatment that's needed, but also indirectly by the pandemic in virtually every country where MSF works. We're seeing health systems that struggle to meet the health needs of people every day, that are now closing down, reducing services, having staff who are affected by the pandemic. We're seeing a massive reduction in services in some places. And then in others, we're seeing an increased strain on the services that we provide, again, because the health systems are in many ways being distorted. So we're filling gaps, we're responding to gaps, but it's actually quite a complex response that we're seeing unfold in many different countries, and it's not uniform by any means. So in some places the demand is high, in other places the demand has been decreased, but that by no means should imply that health conditions are decreasing, because we know that they're not. What it means is that people are probably going without the care that they need, and so we're seeing this on the front line every single day. We're seeing our operations being challenged by a lack of access, a lack of PPE, and ultimately just major challenges in being able to get people to where they need to be, and to get supplies to where they need to be, and to maintain a minimally functional level of service provision. That's complicated by the fact that we are seeing COVID-19 cases that are occurring alongside existing emergencies. So this is in many senses a threat multiplier, if you want to think of it in that sense. What it's doing is creating an even more dangerous set of public health risks. So we've seen cases in the refugee camps of Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh, where there's nearly a million Rohingya refugees living in overcrowded, unsanitary conditions that are perfect for spreading COVID-19. We've seen cases in Haiti, which is a country that I've worked in many times over the last decade, where we opened a COVID-19 treatment center that within days became full and had to double its bed capacity. We had patients who were dying on arrival. Many more were arriving critically ill. And diagnosis was complicated by the fact that there were only a handful of laboratories that were capable of conducting COVID-19 testing, and the health system was clearly ill prepared for what was to come. And this is a story that repeats itself in many different places, in Central African Republic, in South Sudan, in DRC, where we have not just one emergency but multiple overlapping emergencies. In DRC, for example, there's a long-standing armed conflict taking place in the eastern part of the country. We have COVID-19 cases that are occurring in many of the provinces. There's an Ebola outbreak in Equitable province, and then there's the largest measles outbreak on the planet that's also taking place. So you very quickly see that it's not just one issue, it's a compounding of multiple issues that begin to exacerbate and unravel the minimally functional health services that are available in very difficult settings. And so, we, like everybody else, are coming to grips with a real uncomfortable reality, which is that likely our only way out of this pandemic is through a vaccine that currently does not exist as a licensed product. It's something that doesn't exist, but is going to need to be globally accessible to virtually every person on the planet, and quickly. So as of today, the WHO maintains a kind of running database that's really a PDF that's posted online and updated regularly. But today, the pipeline of COVID-19 vaccines is exceptionally robust. There's 154 candidates that are listed as being in preclinical development, another 44 that are in human clinical trials, and they're on multiple different vaccine platforms. We're talking about many different kinds of technologies that are being deployed that have pros, cons, risks, benefits, that all need to be factored in. But I think that this is truly an incredible success story that really shows what happens when global science and open science is mobilized to try and overcome a problem. We've known about this virus for not even a year at this point, and to see this amount of innovation, and including quite late stage clinical trials taking place, is really quite remarkable. Now, there's an asterisk that I think we need to put at the end of that, which is to say, we of course always need additional transparency, and we need to make sure that we have the right regulatory processes in place to make sure that safety or that expedience and timeliness is not coming at the expense of safety. But I think that we have relatively good reason to believe that there's quite a bit of oversight on these vaccine processes to be able to say that, look, this is really quite remarkable what's unfolding. Many of the vaccine candidates are benefiting from billions of dollars of public and philanthropic funding, including from the Canadian government, who's contributed around $1 billion, at least $850 million of funding for COVID-19 diagnostics, treatments, and vaccine R&D. And that's an important piece of this, is to recognize that this truly is a global collaborative effort that's gone into play. And I think that reflecting on that is going to be an incredibly important lesson learned of how we do science effectively and in a timely way. But all to say that, I think quite appropriately, the public has really mobilized a tremendous amount of funding to support, in part, this vaccine R&D. So that's kind of the science piece. I think that's where we are now moving in the conversation around COVID vaccines, where virtually every day the New York Times and the Washington Post and the Globe and Mail and everyone has their story about when is the vaccine coming. Pfizer, I think last week or the week before, said not before the end of November, or depending on how the headline is framed, as soon as November. this is starting to become a reality, that there are going to be very likely vaccines, assuming that the clinical trials show that they're safe and that they're effective, that are going to be made potentially available through an emergency use authorization in the coming months. That's great, except we've got a massive challenge in front of us, which is to try and understand how to get these vaccines to the people who need them. And this is truly an immediate and massive challenge. You've probably heard of something called COVAX. For those of you who are following sort of the global health narrative around COVID-19, COVAX is one of the three pillars of something that's even bigger, the Access to COVID-19 Tools Accelerator, also known as the ACTA, which was launched in April of this year with the aim of stimulating R&D into needed COVID-19 therapeutics, diagnostics, and vaccines. Those are essentially the three pillars of ACTA. COVAX focuses on the latter, which is the vaccines work. So in essence, COVAX is a mechanism, a global mechanism to try and pool risk and purchasing power to allow countries to come together, invest in the development, and the manufacturing, and the equitable distribution of a portfolio of COVID-19 vaccines. It's a global mechanism that's being coordinated by Gavi, which is the Vaccines Alliance, as well as the Coalition for Epidemic Preparedness and Innovation, or CEPI, as well as the WHO. It's providing support for the R&D, as well as for the manufacturing and ultimately the distribution of COVID vaccines once they are available. And so there's other pieces of COVAX, including COVAX facility, and then something called an advanced market commitment, which is essentially an advanced purchase agreement where countries have put a certain amount of money together to incentivize or to lower the risk of manufacturing of doses that would be destined for predominantly lower income countries, though there is also a mechanism for high income countries to self-finance a purchase of doses through that. So in essence, this is a global pooling of risk, of capital, and purchasing power to try and incentivize R&D, but also to incentivize manufacturing capacity at the scale that's going to be required to produce enough doses to meet global demand. From our perspective, we're concerned about a lot of things in COVAX, and happy to get into the details on that. But we're largely concerned that COVAX does very little to actually shift the power imbalance that currently exists in the development and the distribution of health technologies today. We're seeing an unprecedented amount of public spending, appropriately, as I mentioned, on COVID-19 R&D. And that's money that's coming from the public, from taxpayers like you and I, that's being invested in the R&D or in the at-risk manufacturing of these technologies. There's very little transparency into the deals that are being signed. And there's almost no strings that are being attached to the funding that's being mobilized to support the R&D. And the reality of COVID is that all of this is taking place in the court of public opinion in a way that I don't think has ever happened before. But it's in many ways an expedited version of a story that we have seen play out time and time again, where promising medical technologies are supported by the public, by nonprofits, by academia, by a number of different people and entities. But ultimately, we lose control of what happens to them. We lose control of the ability to influence decisions about where they're manufactured, how much is manufactured, where the products are registered, how quickly they're distributed to places of high need, and what the final price is going to be. And we've seen the lack of ability to exert influence over all of these things, despite many of these innovations having their roots in publicly funded entities, universities, and so on. And this is very clearly a moment for the global community and the global health community in particular, I would say, to be trying to push back on this and to try and arrive at a more equitable system of medical R&D, not just for COVID-19, but for other health technologies as well. And certainly that's a piece that we've been working on for many, many years, because we do see this equity gap widening, where our patients continue to wait for years, in some instances decades, for access to medical technologies that are perfectly field appropriate for use in poorly resourced health systems, but simply aren't made available either at a price that's accessible or simply just aren't being registered in places where they live. And so I think COVAX in a way is a bit of a missed opportunity to exert some of that leverage. But again, this is essentially a plane that's being built as it's flying. And so, there's a real opportunity, I think, for us to be critiquing the way that this happens, but it needs to be done in a helpful and a constructive way as well. The reality of the public funding that goes into this is really quite remarkable in my view. We've seen examples in the past few months of the Moderna vaccine, for example, where it's been disclosed recently that it's almost 100% funded by the United States government. And so I think that this is really an opportunity to be exerting some leverage in trying to overcome some of the barriers that we see time and time again related to intellectual property rights being quite restrictive and granting monopolies that are aggressively protected. And I say that not as an ideological positioning, but for the simple reason that it's not going to work in this instance. The demand for COVID-19 vaccines is so high. And I think that we know very clearly that there is no manufacturer on the planet today who's going to be capable of meeting demand. Our only way out of this is through an open, disseminated manufacturing strategy that is going to require essentially an open science and open source kind of approach that allows for quality assured manufacturers to rapidly scale up and distribute in different parts of the world, protecting sort of the business model and the traditional way of doing things is simply not going to work in this instance. And I would say that it's bad public health practice, but it's also just inequitable and unethical to restrict the availability of the supply of these very urgently needed vaccines. I would say that the other piece that we need to be aware of is that COVAX is not the only mechanism through which countries are procuring vaccines. And in fact, the global procurement race, because that's really what it is at this point, is being further complicated by countries who are signing bilateral agreements with manufacturers. And that includes Canada, who's signed multiple bilateral agreements, that I think poses a very real risk of consuming a scarce resource and prioritizing the vaccination of lower risk individuals in rich countries before higher risk individuals in poorer countries. Again, I think this would be ethically and morally wrong, but is also bad public health practice. And these countries are maintaining that, striking these bilateral agreements does not undercut the global market. I find that hard to believe, simply because the available supply is going to be so scarce that it seems unfathomable that procuring enough doses to vaccinate the Canadian population 5 to 7 times over is not going to distort the global procurement race. But I think that we need to dig into that a little bit deeper to understand exactly what intentions are and how this is going to work. But ultimately, what comes out of this is that there needs to be a recognition that we're all in this together. We got into the pandemic together. It is a global pandemic, and if we allow the race to develop, and if we allow the race to develop and access COVID-19 vaccines, treatments, and diagnostic tests to descend into some kind of nationalism, or for access to these technologies to be determined by who can pay the highest price, we're all going to lose. This is going to take longer. It's going to be really quite potentially catastrophic for people living in health systems that struggle to meet health needs every day. And I would say that not only would allowing wealthy countries to have access to essential medicines while poorer countries go without be unconscionable, it would simply be ineffective. We've heard this time and time again, that until all countries and all people have access to new COVID-19 vaccines or medicines, the pandemic doesn't end. So that begs the question of what can be done. I think that first of all, we need to have a conversation about our approach to health innovation and research and development in a general sense. We've seen a massive mobilization of public funding towards COVID-19 R&D. And I think that countries should be attaching strings and common sense safeguards to the funding that they're providing. We're talking about a massive reorganization of the way that drugs and vaccines and other health technologies are developed, but I think that's an entirely appropriate conversation for us to be having in this moment. We should be demanding that no patents are attached to COVID-19 technologies, and we should be pushing for this to happen through an open science model to fully enable scientific collaboration, but also, as I mentioned, to ensure that there's a diversity of manufacturers who can fill in gaps in production capacity to be able to deliver quality assured vaccines. There are some common sense safeguards that need to be applied to all health technologies everywhere. And I think at the heart of this is a reality that if the public is paying to develop something, we collectively shouldn't lose access or control. We should be starting from a position of negotiating for something on the other end, as opposed to allowing the market to determine access. And I say that because we have seen that fail time and time again for our patient. The second thing is that Canada needs to be clear of what its intentions are here. Canada's procured enough doses of COVID-19 vaccine candidates to be able to vaccinate the Canadian population several times over. I think it goes without saying that likely not all of these vaccines will work. But we're, I think, very likely to end up with a surplus of doses of a vaccine that's in global high demand and low supply. Moreover, Canada is paying to expand manufacturing capacity at the National Research Council of Canada's biomanufacturing facility in Montreal, ostensibly to manufacture more doses of COVID-19 vaccines. And I think that we need some additional clarity of what Canada is intending to do with this actually quite robust package of interventions. So a few things. One would be that Canada and other countries that are signing bilateral agreements to purchase vaccines should make some of these doses available for global use. And our position is that this should start with a percentage of the first shipments. So if Canada is procuring from multiple different sources, okay, that's not how we would argue things should have been done. But if that's the route that countries are choosing to go down, then a percentage of those initial shipments should also be allocated to global mechanisms to vaccinate high-risk people in poorer countries. And the second is that surplus doses should be donated quickly to COVAX for use elsewhere. We shouldn't be in the business of hoarding vaccines or at worst, destroying usable vaccines or other health products. I think, as I mentioned, it's very likely that that Canada and other countries have probably over procured. And if that's the case, the surplus should go to somewhere where they can be equitably allocated to meet public health needs. And at the moment, COVAX is the right vehicle for that. And then the third is that I think we need some clarity around Canadian intentions for potentially manufacturing new doses. We've seen this announcement made a couple of times of investments being made in biomanufacturing capabilities domestically, while at the same time we're procuring a large number of doses of vaccine candidates. I think we need some clarity around this because there's a potential for Canada to be in a position to address these global shortages in vaccines through this manufacturing capacity. But we actually have very little in visibility on what Canadian intentions are behind this. So there's a real role, I would say, for Canada to find solutions to what is going to be likely a global shortage of these vaccines. And I think that there's a real interesting conversation to be had around what capacity exists and what the intentions are here to potentially fill these gaps and play this role. So I think we need clarity, and I think that we need movement on this as well. I'm going to end there. I've put, I think, quite a few big ideas on the table for you. So why don't we end there and open it up to questions from you. I'm happy to talk through any of these challenges, any of these issues. I'll of course be honest in saying that there aren't always great answers and great options. Because as I said, we're literally building a plane as it's flying. And so we're trying to coordinate, we're trying to influence many different moving pieces all at one time. And we're talking about some very fundamental systemic problems that we've seen in the way that medicines are developed and allocated globally that are being exacerbated by the COVID-19 pandemic and a race to access affordable and novel COVID-19 vaccines, therapeutics, and other things. But I think that also there are some real fresh challenges that are being put on the table as a result of this as well. So again, happy to talk through any of these. And yeah, why don't we open it up for questions?
Hi, Jason. Dominic here again. That was a really great summary. Such a huge topic and so complex and interesting at the same time. Question is just, I've been involved with MSF for a number of years as an association member, and I know the campaign for access to essential medicines has been such a big part of MSF. Canada, but also other countries and so on, and you've alluded to it. But obviously, I guess the risk with the COVID campaign and so on is just to take so much energy and resources. I guess MSF just has to be careful to make sure to keep going with all the other accesses to all the other medications, TB, for example, and so on. Do you say obviously it's a challenge, but do you think that's going to be an issue?
Yeah, I mean, absolutely. I think that all of us were appropriately distracted by COVID for several months, but very quickly we started to see the spin-off ramifications, and this is what I was talking about in terms of the secondary impacts on other health services. And so that's taken many different forms. Women, for example, are always disproportionately impacted by crises everywhere in the world. But we've seen sexual and reproductive health services, for example, so access to antenatal care, access to basic sexual and reproductive health services, safe abortion care, a number of different health services being deprioritized yet again. So we're facing a massive gap in access to those health services. But then TB, again, an effective TB program requires multiple months of patients often coming to clinic, being on quite toxic regimens of different anti-TB medications and so on. And again, those were often health services that were closed down. Then we've also seen things like malaria spraying in South Sudan or in Central African Republic just didn't happen in some instances this year. So now we're starting to see, we're kind of at the tail end of seasonal malaria season in many of these places, but we've seen a very high number of cases of malaria, in particular in Central African Republic, in one part of the country. So, like the compounding of issues is certainly adding up. From an access campaign perspective, in some ways the COVID-19 pandemic has been helpful, I would say, in building a bit of an understanding of like how drug development actually happens and like who owns the rights to what, who actually calls the shots here. I can't think of another moment in time where the New York Times and other news outlets are publishing the results of like phase 1 clinical trials with 43 participants or something. And, obviously there's a conversation to be had about whether that's appropriate or not. And I think that there's a motivation behind amplifying some of these news releases that are probably more about stock prices than they are about information sharing. But, in some ways, I think it's been helpful because people are paying attention to this in a way that they didn't before. We often have a hard time explaining how like the myriad of issues around access to particularly to new innovative medicines to people, right? Like hepatitis C was a good example of that, where you had sofosbuvir come on the market in 2014 or something. $84,000 was the list price in the US. We've managed to access it for $120 for a 12-week treatment. So that's a massive discrepancy. But trying to explain to people the fact that decisions around product launch essentially are business choices, right? And our patients, despite a massive need for access to hepatitis C treatments, do not represent a lucrative market. And so they got access when Gilead finally got around to signing voluntary licenses and so on, right? Like it takes time because it's a very complicated system. It involves intellectual property rights, it involves contract manufacturers, it involves like all of this stuff. So, I think that what we're trying to do now is to, first of all, our priority was across MSF was to maintain emergency and essential services. And I think that that's a real success of what we managed to accomplish over the last 7 months now, I guess, is that, by and large, our operations continued. And we were able to maintain supply, we were able to maintain staffing levels. And, I think that there's something important that happened there. But certainly on the access campaign, issues is now okay. So as people are paying attention to these access issues, because it affects all of us, how do we kind of build this understanding and say, look, this is actually part of a global access issue that we've been pushing back against for decades now, because our patients face this reality every single day of having this uncertainty of whether, the treatment that they need for sleeping sickness or Chagas or whatever it may be, is that even going to be developed? Is that a priority for an R&D enterprise? And if it is, at what point are they going to get access? I mean, this is a reality that we've faced for 50 years. And so now how do we kind of capitalize on this discomfort that I think we all have around asking many of the same questions, and try and build some global movement to try and push us towards a more equitable system.
Yeah. Great, thank you. Any other questions?
There's a question in the chat from Amanda. She asked, just wondering, how will vaccine hesitancy public acceptance be considered with how the vaccine is distributed?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a $1 million question. I get asked this question a lot by journalists, by policymakers, and I think first of all we need to face the reality that like vaccine hesitancy is a major public health threat globally. There's a I mean, I'm telling you things you already know, but there's a tremendous amount of disinformation that's out there about vaccines and public health generally. But that's being amplified, I would say, by a lack of transparency that exists across, across the medical research and development landscape. And we and others have been pushing for increased transparency and in this whole system. And I think that this is an idea that's certainly permeated into academia. I mean, there's obviously a push of open access publishing, and certainly from my experience, most researchers that I've worked with, depending on their field, are certainly moving towards models of open science for drug development and for other things. I mean, it's an issue of efficiency. It reduces duplication. It's one of these things where everybody benefits. So, I think that the way, again, the way around this is that we're talking about something that's actually quite systemic and quite fundamental, which is that if we want to push back on this vaccine hesitancy, and if we want to convince people that vaccines are safe, we need to be able to demonstrate that transparently. We need visibility and independent analysis and auditing of data sets of all of the things that go into making a regulatory submission and conducting clinical trials and the whole spectrum of it. And I think that's certainly one way that we can push back on this, because I agree it's a massive problem that, even once we have the vaccine or multiple vaccines, convincing people that it's safe after it's been, we've spent so many years saying like, vaccines are safe because we spend decades developing them and analyzing the data and so on. And now we're in this place where we're potentially going to have a vaccine that went from bench to bedside in under a year. I think the only way that we can fully convey honestly the safety and efficacy of this is by having as much transparent analysis and independent analysis of this data as possible, and that's a very big ask, and it's in many ways pushing back on a way of doing things that not everyone involved in the system wants to move forward with.
I was wondering if I could just make a comment on that, if possible.
Yeah,
one of the things that I thought I always think about with these vaccines and how fast they're being developed is it's not like we're starting from scratch necessarily. Like it's being, built on systems that have been used in research for, 10, 20 years to develop vaccines. So I'm wondering if you think trying to convey that would help with some of the new vaccine hesitancy that's going to arise because of this perceived rush. I don't know what you think about that.
Yeah, I mean, probably. I suspect there's people on this call who know more about vaccine platforms than I do. But yeah, I mean, that seems logical to me. That I mean, you're absolutely right that we didn't start with nothing, right? It wasn't like January 1st of this year. We had absolutely nothing, and no research had ever been done into coronavirus vaccines before. So yeah, I mean, I think that's potentially one really valuable aspect of this. And I think on that note as well, that's another incentive, I would say, to be looking at how we retain some of the rights and some of the access to these technologies. This is not the first coronavirus pandemic that we're likely to face. This is not the first coronavirus outbreak and epidemic that we've faced in the last 20 years. I was still a student during the first SARS in 2003, and I mean, I remember triaging patients at the entry to the emergency department. Like we're going to run into this again. So I think the point here is that when we have a fair and global access to these platforms, it expedites the potential development of new technologies, and that's something that I think is going to be incredibly critical for us to retain control of. It would be a real shame for some of these platforms to be, just patented like mad and really restricted to use to a few select labs and researchers, which hopefully isn't one of the outcomes of this. I think there is a question. Could you comment on the state of the vaccines which are now on hold by FDA? The same are being used in clinical trials in other countries. How could the public have faith in these even if they are not efficacious? Yeah, I mean, good question. So I have to admit that we're very much product agnostic, I'll say. So I'm not following the vaccine development for each vaccine terribly closely. We're trying to kind of maintain kind of a global overview of what the manufacturing capacity is for the different platforms, and then also keeping a bit of visibility on some of the higher profile vaccines. But certainly getting into the question of the trials, I think what you're referring to are the trials that have been stopped because there's been a couple of adverse events. I mean, I think this is, again, it comes back to a bit of a conversation, a societal conversation around the role of science and how science operates. And it's quite normal for a data safety and monitoring board to stop a trial and do a deep dive and a root cause analysis of what's happened. But I don't know the specifics of, I see AstraZeneca and the J&J vaccine. I don't actually know the specifics of why these trials have been stopped and what the outcome of it has been. But it's not unusual for a clinical trial to hit pause when there are adverse events. And I think that trying to communicate this is a real challenge for people, because it seems like, oh, we've made this massive progress in such a short period of time, and then one person develops an adverse event and the whole thing gets derailed. And that's, these are complicated endeavors and complicated processes to try and explain to people in a hurry. And I think that's just where we find ourselves. So unfortunately, I don't have a real in-depth answer to what the actual implications of stopping the trials are. But yeah, no one knows. That's the problem, a lack of transparency. Yeah, I agree. I mean, I think that this is, again, all the more reason to ensure that we have additional transparency in this entire system. There's a bad history here. There's a very bad track record of what the impact of a lack of transparency has meant for drug development in particular. And we're facing a bit of a reckoning here.
Just one more question that was sent to me privately. Given the massive challenge in actually immunizing once a good vaccine is available, which countries, the worst hit, will get the vaccine, and which populations will be prioritized for immunization? That is the elderly, healthcare workers?
Yeah, I mean, this is one of the questions. So there is, the World Health Organization came out with something called an equitable allocation framework over the summer that proposed essentially this, trying to define who the priority population should be for receiving the initial doses of vaccine. And it was the elderly, it was healthcare workers, and then there were other comorbidities that were included that kind of added up, made up about 20% of a country's population. So in many ways, that's an appropriate exercise. It is an appropriate exercise to go through. I mean, we're challenged by the fact that the best data that are available on all of these things exist for high-income countries. So I think we need to be very careful and very cautious that an exercise designed to ensure equitable allocation doesn't kind of inadvertently, or at least unintentionally, exacerbate existing inequities and discrepancies. So I think that there's certainly a complicated set of concerns that are there, but there is an equitable allocation framework, and certainly, we're an organization that operates on the basis of need, right? We go to where the needs are the highest, and we prioritize care to people who need it the most. So certainly our perspective is that highest risk people need access to vaccine first, regardless of where they live, and who those people are is going to change slightly, based on countries and contexts and so on. But certainly, I mean, we are talking about the need to ensure that healthcare workers are vaccinated, that people with comorbidities are vaccinated, people in refugee camps and other places have access to the vaccine. And maybe just quickly, the other thing that wasn't clearly included in the equitable allocation framework were comorbidities that are predominantly prevalent in low-income countries, so malnutrition, malaria, endemic regions, and so on. There's a lot of very complicated calculus that goes into this to make sure that we truly are prioritizing people who are the most vulnerable.
There's another one there that you can see from Krishna.
Yeah. If given data that vaccines may be more effective for younger age groups than older, more vulnerable age groups, I'm curious to hear what types of things will need to be considered to make the decision on when to optimally roll out the vaccine. Yeah. So maybe there's one thing that I think is important to recognize here, which is that we're not really talking about one vaccine. I guess the way in which most of us talk about it is that we talk about the COVID-19 vaccine, but likely what we're going to end up with is a bunch of vaccines that work in slightly different ways for different people. Because as you probably all know, vaccines are all a little bit different, right? Some of them stop us from developing severe forms of the illness, but they don't necessarily stop us from becoming infected. Others stop us from getting sick and stop us from transmitting the virus or the illness onto other people. So, there's a lot of different ways in which vaccines work in our bodies and as a public health tool. So I think it's very likely that we're going to end up, hopefully, with vaccines that, kind of work in different ways for different people. And so how we're going to effectively target them to these different age groups and so on, I honestly don't know. I mean, I think that's a very good question to be asking Canadian public health officials, but I think that this is very clearly something that we're going to need to try and understand quickly and develop a distribution mechanism to be able to make those decisions. And whether that becomes sort of, public health level guidance or individual clinician decisions, I don't really know. We'll have to see what the evidence shows us, I guess. What factors are considered when defining priority populations? It's a bit of what I said earlier. I think that there are very clearly people who are at risk because they live in places of compounded public health risks on a day-to-day basis. I mean, I talked about the roughly 1 million Rohingya refugees who are living in Cox's Bazar in Bangladesh. There are many camps and crowded and congested places where people live around the world, where access to clean water is minimal. Access to basic water and sanitation services is inadequate. Access to basically any essential services is inadequate. So how that plays into sort of a clear matrix of comorbidities and so on, I think is unclear. But certainly there are vulnerable people who are just obviously vulnerable and who need to have access to basic public health tools like a COVID vaccine. So, I think that we have the things that are sort of axiomatically clear and obvious that are in front of us, like people living in a congested refugee camp. This is, nobody should be living in these conditions to begin with. But there's a very clear public health necessity of ensuring proper vaccination coverage if people are living in an overcrowded, congested camp with poor access to health services. But then otherwise, there are things like comorbidities. Healthcare workers, again, are very clearly a priority population. And how we define priority populations, this has sort of been an evolving conversation in global public health for many years. But in essence, I would say that's it.
I have one question.
Sure.
Actually, it's a comment as well. I'm old enough to have been around for the HIV when that came to be, HIV/AIDS, and it was so heavily politicized, and I'm sure all of you are too young to be aware of it. And it was because it was especially in North America, a specific population. But if you ever have an opportunity to read the book and the band played on, it reveals the infighting amongst scientists, the politicization, because it was a homosexual population, men in particular, and so that development could have taken a much shorter time, but it was delayed for considerable amount of time, and people were dying horrible deaths. So what's amazing to me is how quickly they identified the agent and how quickly all of these vaccines are being developed. But my fear is that it will still be politicized to benefit, as we see so often, the wealthy countries, because they have the power to purchase vaccines and vaccinate their own, as opposed to the groups that you're helping, that, MSF is helping. And I guess my concern is, how do you limit, and how can we help as citizens limit that politicization so that it can be delivered as quickly as possible to the most needy?
Yeah, I mean, like we face a real reality that the global pharmaceutical industry is not set up to achieve this objective, right? It's set up to, it's a private enterprise. It's set up to maximize profits, and they're actually quite transparent about this. It's the most profitable industry on the planet, more so than mining, extractives, oil and gas, and so on. So it is set up to maximize profitability and not to ensure global access. And I think that there is a real risk that access is prioritized for countries that are, as you say, willing to pay the high prices. And we're seeing this splintering already in these bilateral deals that are being made by Canada, the United States, European Union, and some others. So, what can be done? I think, first of all, we need to be, as I said, we need to be pushing back on countries that are signing these bilateral deals, and they need to be finding a way of, allocating at least some of these doses back to a global coordination mechanism. So we would argue that, as I say, like, if you're signing these bilateral deals, and a percentage of your shipments, your first shipments, need to go right back into the global pot. We need to be vaccinating high-risk people before we are vaccinating low-risk people, and I think that's very clear in the interests of global public health. But that requires there to be a functioning global allocation mechanism, which is in essence the plane that's being built as it's flying, which is the global COVAX system. It's imperfect. There are problems with it, and so on. But we also need to be realistic about the fact that this is the only global mechanism to potentially equitably allocate COVID-19 vaccines once they become available. So, that requires a mix of funding, and Canada indeed has stepped up with funding, as have other countries. I don't think it's fully funded, so we need to get to that point, right? It needs to be money in the bank to be able to purchase this stuff, but it's not just about funding either. And I think this is where we can't let countries and the pharmaceutical industry off the hook here, is to say, look, if this global mechanism is funded, but there's actually nothing to purchase because it's all been bought up by wealthy countries, then we've got a fundamental problem. So this is where, I don't think that we should just leave the system to operate the way that it has, because, as I say, it's not set up to actually even produce enough quantity of the stuff to be able to meet global demand. It's that we need to be pushing to overcome all of the barriers to a really quite broad and disseminated manufacturing strategy. We are going to need manufacturing capacity in all corners of the planet that are capable of producing quality assured batches of vaccine. And that's by no means a small undertaking, but it also is going to mean that we're going to have to overcome barriers like intellectual property rights that allow a small number of companies to retain monopolies that they are very clearly not prepared to give up. So, you're getting into vaccine politics, you're getting into innovation policy, you're getting into intellectual property rights and so on. But I actually think that the path forward, I think in many instances we know what needs to be done, but we need to be pressuring countries to simply get on with doing this. We need to push them to, as I say, allocate doses that have been purchased for global use, global access, need to fund the global mechanisms for distributing it. But then we also need to push them to actually have the policies in place to overcome some of these barriers that we see time and time again, like patents and other things.
Okay, Dominic, you want to say a few words in conclusion?
Sure. Yeah. Thanks so much, Jason. I think in the interest of time, we'll finish there. But on behalf of everyone and our global health program and the faculty of medicine and so on, we really thank you, Jason, for taking time to be with us and share your knowledge, your experience, and a great discussion on such an important topic. I'll throw a little plug in that MSF, as we all know, does amazing work all around the world and has its work cut out with COVID and so on. So if anyone wants to donate it, I think it's always much appreciated for sure. So anyways, Jason, thanks so much. And if more questions come up, or maybe we could send you an email or so if
Absolutely.
If a bit of a follow-up if needed. So thanks for everything.
Okay, my pleasure. Thanks so much for inviting me.
Okay, thank you.
Okay, bye-bye.
Take care. Okay.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.